Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the show that digs into the source material behind complex ideas and, well, tries to make sense of it all for you. Today we're tackling something that feels, well, wrong almost. The idea that some of the biggest leaps forward, especially in creative fields like video games, didn't come from everyone getting along. Instead, they came from conflict, from tension, rivalry. Our mission today is to dive deep into some of those grudges, the big public ones, and the quieter internal battles that really shaped modern gaming. We're looking at four kinds of conflict. You've got the big corporate wars, those internal feuds that can just suffocate creativity, partnerships that fracture, and maybe my favorite, stories of pure visionary defiance. These aren't just business tales. They're about how friction, weirdly enough, can be the engine for progress.
It's a fascinating pattern, isn't it? Because think about it, when everything's comfortable, when there's consensus, things tend to slow down. Innovation often stagnates. But the moment you introduce a real rival, whether that's another company breathing down your neck or sometimes your own bosses questioning things, suddenly you're forced to rethink everything, every assumption, just to stay in the game. The history of gaming really, it's like a record of this constant creative pressure.
Okay, let's jump right in then. Let's unpack that with probably the most famous example, the mascot war. Early 90s, Mario versus Sonic. We all remember the console war ads, but the sources we looked at suggest this was deeper. It was like a philosophical fight between two key designers, Shigeru Miyamoto at Nintendo and Yuji Naka at Sega.
Oh, absolutely. Fundamentally different approaches. You had Miyamoto, who was all about meticulous, timeless design. His core philosophy, precision, control. Look at Super Mario World back in 1990. That game is, well, it's a masterclass in making the player feel in control. Every jump, every movement feels predictable, fair. It rewards patience, mastering the mechanics. Masterpiece of control is how one source put it.
And then Naka comes along at Sega, basically saying, forget patience.
Right. He was all about pushing boundaries, about speed. He saw games almost as kinetic art. Sonic the Hedgehog in '91 wasn't just another character. It was explicitly designed to be the anti-Mario.
It was a statement.
A huge statement. Mario was careful. Sonic was, well, reckless. Mario was about physics. Sonic was about pure momentum, that feeling of speed, the rush. Sega didn't just compete on the console specs. They competed on attitude. Remember blast processing?
Oh, yeah. Kind of meaningless technically, wasn't it?
Technically. Mostly, yeah. But as marketing, genius. It perfectly captured that feeling. It positioned Sega as edgy, fast, powerful, directly challenging Nintendo's sort of wholesome family fun image.
And it's kind of amazing that this intense rivalry played out mostly through the games themselves. Like, Miyamoto and Naka weren't out there trash-talking each other publicly.
No, it was quieter, fought on the screen.
Yeah.
But the impact, huge. It fundamentally shaped the platformer genre. It was what you call productive friction. Sega proved speed could work, that it was fun. And that forced Nintendo, to push their own precision design even further in response. The whole genre had to evolve, finding this new balance between, let's say, precision and adrenaline, patience versus momentum. That balance came directly out of that rivalry.
And then, years later, you get that symbolic moment, Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Games, the handshake, finally.
Yeah, after a decade of pushing each other, they end up in the same game, a kind of resolution. But that brings us to a different kind of conflict, because sometimes the fiercest battles aren't external between companies, they're internal, inside the building. This is where it gets really messy, but also incredibly interesting. The artist versus the machine, Hideo Kojima versus Konami.
Right, Kojima, Metal Gear Solid. He wasn't just seen as a game developer, was he? The sources paint him as this auteur, like a filmmaker who just happened to work with code instead of celluloid. His games were cinematic, complex, deeply personal, and yeah, they made Konami a ton of money for a long time.
We did. But that kind of auteur vision, it comes with baggage, especially for a publicly traded company. Kojima's games were famously expensive. They often blew past deadlines. And the storytelling, while brilliant, was ambitious, maybe unpredictable from a purely commercial standpoint. That makes executives, whose main job is hitting quarterly targets, pretty nervous.
So tensions were there for a while, but our sources point to Metal Gear Solid V, the Phantom Pain, as the real breaking point. Why that one? After years of success, why did Konami suddenly decide the risk wasn't worth the reward?
That's the million-dollar question, or rather, the half-billion-dollar question, depending on which development cost estimates you believe for MGSV. It was just chasing this immense scale, cinematic and gameplay-wise. Budgets reportedly ballooned, release dates kept slipping. The board likely saw this huge investment, this massive uncertainty, and just panicked. Kojima wanted art, the board needed a product. on time, on budget. The sheer ambition of MGSV seems to have tipped the scales.
And the fallout in 2015 was, wow, very public. Kojima's name literally scrubbed from the game's box art and marketing, reports of restricted access to his own studio, and then being barred from attending the Game Awards, where MGSV actually won Best Action Game. That felt less like a business split and more like a statement.
It was absolutely a statement, a message, maybe, to other creatives in the industry about who ultimately held the power. But the fan reaction was immediate and intense. People rallied around Kojima. He became this symbol of creative integrity fighting against, corporate control. And he didn't just disappear.
No, he founded his own studio and came back with Death Stranding, which was definitely an act of rebellion.
Totally. That game was strange, ambitious, deeply personal, almost aggressively not chasing mainstream trends. It felt like Kojima saying, you can take my name off the old thing, but you can't control my vision. This whole saga really forced a big question onto the table. Can a game be true, singular art when the business side absolutely needs it to be a predictable, marketable product? It pushed the conversation about creative freedom forward.
That tension, art versus business, ambition versus restraint, it doesn't just happen internally. It can also tear apart really successful partnerships. Which brings us to Rare and Nintendo.
Rare. Yeah, back in the 90s, this small British studio was basically Nintendo's secret weapon. They were incredible. Donkey Kong Country, GoldenEye 007, Banjo-Kazooie, Perfect Dark, hit after hit. They had this unique style, right? Very polished, but also playful, maybe a bit anarchic sometimes. That was their DNA.
Nintendo gave them a lot of rope, it seems. The sources call it a creative sandbox. They were stuck on Nintendo hardware, sure, but inside that box they had the freedom and resources to really innovate. But Rare got bigger, more ambitious, and maybe that sandbox started to feel a bit small.
Exactly. Rare started wanting more. They envisioned themselves developing for multiple platforms, exploring tech that maybe Nintendo, which has always been somewhat cautious, wasn't ready for. So you had Rare's ambition pushing against Nintendo's, let's call it, restraint. The sources say things really came to a head after Perfect Dark. Rare felt they'd proven their worth, maybe deserved more freedom, a higher valuation. Nintendo disagreed on some key points, especially future strategy.
And the result was the split in 2002. Rare gets sold to Microsoft for a huge sum, $375 million. That ended a really important era.
It was massive for both sides. Nintendo lost arguably its most daring experimental studio, the one that really pushed them hard in the early 3D era. And Rare, well, under Microsoft, they struggled for a long time to recapture that specific magic. The environment changed. Maybe that unique Rare DNA needed that tension. Nintendo's high standards pushing against Rare's wild creativity. It shows how fragile those really successful creative partnerships can be. Sometimes getting exactly what you thought you wanted, like total freedom from your old partner, isn't actually the best thing for the creative output itself.
That's a tough lesson. But you still see glimpses of that DNA, right? Even years later in games like Sea of Thieves, that playful spirit maybe survived the breakup.
It suggests the creative drive of the people involved persists, definitely. Which actually leads us nicely to our last story. Because if Rare versus Nintendo was a partnership breaking under pressure, our fourth example, Ken Kutaragi and the birth of PlayStation, that's a story of victory through pure internal defiance. One person against the system.
Right, Kutaragi, the father of PlayStation. But he started as just an engineer at Sony in the late 80s, didn't he? And he was secretly working on tech for Nintendo, a sound chip for the Super Famicom.
He was, and apparently when Sony executives found out, they were absolutely furious. You have to remember Sony's image back then. They were the Walkman, the Trinitron TV people, Sirius Electronics, gaming. Inside Sony, it was largely seen as, well, beneath them, kid stuff, a fad. Kutaragi was basically risking his career, tinkering with this stuff that the bosses thought was lowbrow.
So he wasn't just fighting technical challenges, he was fighting the entire corporate culture at Sony. He saw gaming's future, but his superiors were, reportedly, even mocking his efforts.
Yet they apparently called his little skunkworks team Kutaragi's kids. Kind of dismissive. But then came the big turning point. Nintendo publicly ditched Sony on their planned CD-ROM add-on partnership in 1991. Humiliating for Sony. But Kutaragi saw his chance. He used that rejection, that corporate anger to convince Sony, let me build our own console. Let's show Nintendo.
Okay, so he gets the green light, maybe grudgingly. But now he has to actually succeed in a market dominated by Nintendo and Sega, by Miyamoto and Naka.
And he was smart about it. Strategically brilliant. He leaned into what Sony did well, CD-ROM technology. Way more storage than cartridges. That was a huge differentiator. And crucially, he actively courted third-party developers, treated them like partners, not subordinates, which was a big departure from how Nintendo and Sega often operated back then. He made PlayStation the easier, more welcoming platform to develop for.
So he was fighting on two fronts, internally against the skeptics at Sony and externally against the established giant.
It's exactly. The competitors, Nintendo and Sega, kind of underestimated Sony as this newcomer, and internally. Many executives were probably hoping he'd fail so they can get back to making TVs. But Kutaragi was just relentlessly stubborn. He believed in gaming not just as tech, but as culture, and he pushed it through.
And the rest, as they say, is history. By the late 90s, around 99, the PlayStation hadn't just competed, it had outsold the Nintendo 64. It completely changed the game, turning gaming from a niche into this mainstream cultural force. An entire revolution born from one engineer basically refusing to take no for an answer.
And if you weave all four stories together, Miyamoto versus Naka, Kojima versus Konami, Rare versus Nintendo, Kutaragi versus Sony's own inertia, you see this clear thread. It's the power of that productive friction we talked about. Rivalry, tension, disagreement. It often forces innovation. It sharpens focus. It makes people push harder than they might have otherwise.
So wrapping this up for you, the listener, we looked at four kinds of conflict. The external battle, like Mario versus Sonic, pushed the actual craft, the techniques of game design. The internal war, Kojima versus Konami, forced questions about art, freedom, and corporate control. The partnership split, Rare and Nintendo, highlighted that delicate, often difficult balance between creative ambition and the need for some kind of structure or restraint.
And Kutaragi's story shows how sheer individual defiance against a system can literally create entirely new markets, new cultural movements like PlayStation. The pattern seems undeniable. So much of gaming history was shaped by this tension. Tension between the established players and the disruptors, between the corporations wanting predictable products and the creators wanting to make art. Conflict spurred innovation. Because every time one side got comfortable, the other side effectively said, not good enough, I can do better.
That sums it up perfectly. The greatest leaps often weren't made in peace and quiet. They were hammered out in the heat of friction. So here's something for you to maybe chew on. If progress really does require this kind of tension, this friction, well, what if rivalry isn't the enemy of creativity, but actually the fuel, the necessary spark that keeps imagination fired up? Maybe the next time you see a big breakthrough in gaming or anywhere else, ask yourself, whose argument made this happen? Whose challenge, whose refusal to accept the status quo forced this leap forward? Because progress doesn't usually happen when everyone just nods along. It happens when someone stands up and says, with absolute conviction, watch me.